Long before Portugal commanded fleets that crossed every major ocean, before its banners flew over ports in India, Brazil, Africa, and East Asia, it was little more than a narrow strip of land on the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula. It was not rich. It was not powerful. It was surrounded by stronger kingdoms, threatened by conflict, and positioned at what many Europeans of the time considered the very end of the known world. Yet from this unlikely beginning would emerge an empire unlike anything history had seen before. For nearly 600 years, Portugal maintained overseas possessions that stretched across 4 continents. It pioneered oceanic exploration on a scale that reshaped global trade, connected distant civilizations, accelerated cultural exchange, and also played a central role in one of history's darkest systems, the Atlantic slave trade. Its influence reached from the forests of South America to the coasts of Japan, from the shores of East Africa to the harbors of China. The rise of Portugal was not the result of a single brilliant king, one extraordinary explorer, or one fortunate discovery. It was the product of centuries of political decisions, religious ambitions, technological innovation, commercial competition, military campaigns, and geographical opportunity. To understand how this happened, we must begin not with ships sailing toward unknown horizons, but with a struggle for survival on land. In the early Middle Ages, the Iberian Peninsula looked very different from the political map we know today. Large portions of the peninsula were under Muslim rule following the Umayyad conquest of the 8th century. Christian kingdoms survived primarily in the north, gradually expanding southward through a long and complex series of conflicts that later became known collectively as the Reconquista. These campaigns were not continuous wars fought without interruption, but rather centuries of shifting alliances, political rivalries, military expeditions, truces, and changing borders. Religion certainly played an important role, but so did dynastic ambition, territorial expansion, and control over valuable agricultural lands and trade routes. Among these northern Christian territories was the County of Portugal. At first, it was not an independent kingdom. It existed as a frontier region under the authority of the Kingdom of Leon. Frontier territories were dangerous places. Raids, skirmishes, and changing borders were common. Nobles living there developed military traditions out of necessity. They also learned that survival often depended upon independence of action. These conditions would shape Portuguese political culture for generations. The county itself had been entrusted to Henry of Burgundy, a French nobleman who arrived during the wider conflicts of the Reconquista. Through marriage into the Leonese royal family, Henry gained authority over the region. His son, Afonso Henriquez, inherited not only the county, but also an ambition that would permanently change the history of Western Europe. Afonso Henriquez grew up during a period of political uncertainty. After the death of his father, power was exercised largely through his mother, Teresa, whose political alliances became increasingly controversial among the Portuguese nobility. Opposition grew. Eventually, tensions erupted into open conflict. In the year 1128, at the Battle of São Mamede, Afonso defeated the forces supporting his mother's rule. Historians often view this battle as one of the first major milestones in the emergence of an independent Portugal. Although independence was not yet internationally recognized, the victory established Afonso as the dominant political figure within the county. Over the following years, Afonso expanded his authority through both diplomacy and warfare. His campaigns targeted Muslim-held territories to the south, while also carefully managing relations with neighboring Christian kingdoms. Every military success strengthened his position. Every new fortress secured his frontier. Every diplomatic agreement increased the possibility that Portugal might become something more than a dependent county. Tradition associates one of his greatest victories with the Battle of Arique in the year 1139. Medieval chronicles describe the battle in dramatic terms, sometimes including miraculous accounts that reflected the religious worldview of the period. Modern historians debate many aspects of these stories, including the exact details of the battle itself. But there is broad agreement that around this time, Afonso began presenting himself not merely as a count, but as King of Portugal. The title alone did not guarantee recognition. Medieval legitimacy depended upon acceptance by neighboring rulers and, equally important, by the papacy. Recognition came gradually. Diplomatic negotiations continued for decades. Finally, in 1179, Pope Alexander III issued the papal bull Manifestus Probatum, recognizing Afonso as king and Portugal as an independent Christian kingdom. This papal acknowledgement gave Portugal both political legitimacy and religious authority within medieval Europe. It also marked the birth of one of Europe's oldest continuously existing nation-states. Geography now became one of Portugal's greatest advantages. Looking east, expansion meant confronting powerful neighbors whose resources exceeded Portugal's own. Looking west, however, lay the Atlantic Ocean. To many Europeans, the Atlantic remained mysterious and intimidating. It represented uncertainty more than opportunity. Ancient legends spoke of monsters beyond the horizon. Sailors feared powerful currents, violent storms, and seas from which no one returned. Yet for Portugal, the ocean would eventually become less a barrier than a gateway. Throughout the 13th century, Portuguese rulers continued expanding southward during the later stages of the Reconquista. Under kings such as Sancho II and Afonso III, Portuguese armies gradually captured territory from Muslim rulers until the conquest of the Algarve was completed in 1249. With that achievement, Portugal had essentially reached the borders it still possesses today. Few European states can claim such remarkable territorial continuity across nearly 8 centuries. Securing stable borders produced an unexpected consequence. Many European kingdoms remained occupied by endless territorial disputes with their neighbors. Portugal, by contrast, increasingly found itself looking outward rather than inward. Since significant expansion on the peninsula was politically difficult, attention slowly shifted toward commerce, navigation, and the Atlantic coastline. This transformation was supported by gradual economic development. Medieval Portugal remained overwhelmingly rural. Most people lived from agriculture. Noble families controlled large estates. The church possessed immense wealth and influence. Yet towns slowly expanded. Lisbon grew as an important commercial center. Porto developed through trade along the Douro River. Coimbra became an intellectual and administrative center. Markets expanded. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds. Merchants accumulated wealth through regional commerce. These urban communities would eventually supply the financial resources, skilled labor, and maritime experience necessary for overseas expansion. One ruler deserved particular attention during this formative period. King Denis, who reigned from 1279 until 1325, focused less on conquest than on administration and development. Sometimes remembered as the farmer king, he promoted agriculture, encouraged reforestation, improved legal institutions, and supported education. He founded the University of Coimbra, though it initially operated in Lisbon before later returning permanently to Coimbra. Higher education strengthened administrative capacity and produced officials capable of managing an increasingly sophisticated kingdom. Venice also recognized the growing importance of naval power. While Portugal's maritime institutions continued developing long after his reign, his support for naval organization helped establish traditions that later rulers expanded significantly. The seeds of Portugal's future oceanic ambitions were already being planted. Meanwhile, the wider world continued changing. Across the Mediterranean, Venice and Genoa dominated maritime commerce between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Muslim merchants controlled many of the great overland routes linking Europe with Asia. Luxury goods including pepper, cinnamon, silk, precious stones, and fine textiles reached European markets through long commercial networks involving countless intermediaries. Every transaction increased prices. European rulers dreamed of bypassing these routes entirely. Portugal occupied a unique geographical position within this changing economic landscape. Standing at Europe's western edge, it possessed direct access to the Atlantic, unlike most continental kingdoms. At first, this offered only modest commercial advantages. But gradually, Portuguese merchants and rulers began considering possibilities that others viewed as unrealistic. If eastern trade routes were blocked by political rivals, perhaps ships could discover entirely new paths across the sea. Religion also remained deeply intertwined with these ambitions. Medieval Portugal had emerged through the Reconquista, and its political identity became closely connected with Catholic Christianity. Military victories were frequently interpreted as evidence of divine favor. Expansion against Muslim powers was often framed not simply as political competition, but as participation in a sacred mission. These religious convictions would later accompany Portuguese sailors into Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas. Missionary activity, conversion, crusading ideals, and commerce would become closely linked throughout the empire's history. Yet Portugal's rise was never inevitable. During the 14th century, the kingdom faced severe crises that threatened its survival. In 1348, the Black Death reached Portugal as it did much of Europe. The pandemic devastated communities. Although exact numbers remain uncertain, historians estimate that perhaps 1/3 of the population died. Entire villages disappeared. Agricultural production declined sharply. Labor shortages transformed economic relationships. Survivors often gained greater bargaining power, weakening aspects of the traditional feudal system. Social tensions increased as established hierarchies came under pressure. As if plague were not enough, dynastic instability soon followed. King Ferdinand died in 1383 without a surviving male heir. His daughter Beatrice had married King John I of Castile, raising the possibility that Portugal would effectively lose its independence through dynastic union. Many Portuguese nobles accepted this outcome. Others fiercely opposed it. Opposition eventually rallied around João, master of the Order of Avis, an illegitimate son of an earlier Portuguese king. His supporters included merchants, sections of the nobility, urban populations, and many who feared domination by Castile. Civil conflict erupted. Everything culminated at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385. The odds appeared unfavorable for Portugal. Castile fielded a significantly larger army, supported by French knights. Portuguese commanders, however, selected defensive terrain carefully. They employed tactical innovations, including prepared defensive positions, obstacles, disciplined infantry formations, and effective coordination with English longbowmen who had arrived through long-standing diplomatic ties. The result became one of the defining military victories in Portuguese history. The Castilian army suffered a decisive defeat. Portugal preserved its independence. João was crowned King João I, establishing the House of Avis. This victory resonated far beyond the battlefield. It confirmed Portugal as an independent kingdom. It strengthened national identity. It united important social groups behind the new dynasty. It also reinforced Portugal's alliance with England through the Treaty of Windsor, signed in 1386. Remarkably, this alliance remains one of the oldest continuously recognized diplomatic relationships in the world. The House of Avis inherited not merely a secure throne, but a kingdom increasingly prepared for larger ambitions. João I married Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt and a member of the English royal family. Their children became known collectively as the illustrious generation. They received unusually broad educations by medieval standards, studying languages, religion, military affairs, geography, and administration. Among them was a prince whose reputation would become inseparable from the earliest chapter of European oceanic exploration. His name was Henry. History remembers him as Prince Henry the Navigator. The title can be somewhat misleading. Henry himself was not primarily an explorer who spent decades personally sailing across unknown oceans. Instead, his importance lay in organization, patronage, planning, and long-term vision. He recognized that exploration required more than courage. It demanded investment, shipbuilding, cartography, astronomy, mathematics, logistics, diplomacy, and sustained royal commitment. Before Henry's great projects truly began, however, Portugal first looked south across the narrow waters separating Europe from North Africa. In 1415, Portuguese forces launched an expedition against the city of Ceuta. Located on the northern coast of present-day Morocco, Ceuta occupied an extraordinarily valuable position. Caravans arriving from sub-Saharan Africa carried gold, ivory, and other goods northward. Mediterranean merchants connected these products to wider commercial networks stretching into Europe and the Middle East. Whoever controlled Ceuta hoped to benefit from this flow of commerce. Religious motivations also played an important role. Capturing a Muslim city fit naturally within the crusading traditions that had shaped Portuguese identity for centuries. For many participants, the expedition represented both military conquest and spiritual duty. The assault succeeded. Ceuta became Portugal's first permanent overseas possession. Although expectations of controlling trans-Saharan commerce ultimately proved overly optimistic, the conquest established an entirely new precedent. Portugal had projected military power beyond Europe. An overseas empire, though still unimaginable in its later form, had begun to take shape. Following the conquest, Prince Henry became deeply involved in promoting further exploration along the Atlantic coast of Africa. Later traditions often describe him establishing a famous navigation school at Sagres. Modern historians debate whether such a formal institution ever existed exactly as later generations imagined. There is little evidence for a university like academy devoted solely to navigation. Nevertheless, there is strong evidence that Henry gathered skilled pilots, cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, mathematicians, and experienced sailors whose collective expertise steadily improved Portuguese maritime knowledge. Equally important were technological developments. Portuguese shipbuilders refined vessels that became known as caravels. Unlike heavier medieval cargo ships, caravels combined relatively small size with remarkable maneuverability. Their lateen sails allowed experienced crews to sail closer to the wind than many earlier vessels. This flexibility made them especially effective for coastal exploration, where changing winds and uncertain conditions demanded constant adjustment. Navigation also improved. The magnetic compass became more widely used. The astrolabe helped determine latitude. Portal on charts recorded coastlines with increasing accuracy. Each expedition returned not only with cargo, but with information. Every voyage expanded collective knowledge. Every captain contributed observations. Every coastline carefully mapped reduced uncertainty for those who followed. Yet fear remained a formidable obstacle. European sailors long regarded Cape Bojador on the western coast of Africa as the edge of navigable waters. Legends warned of terrifying currents, unbearable heat, monsters, and oceans that became impossible to cross. In 1434, the Portuguese navigator Gil Eanes sailed beyond the Cape and returned safely. The psychological significance of this achievement cannot be overstated. Nothing supernatural waited beyond Cape Bojador. The Atlantic could be explored. The unknown had become knowable. The next voyage could go farther, then another farther still. Over the following decades, Portuguese expeditions continued progressing gradually southward along the West African coastline. They did not leap immediately toward India. Instead, progress came through patience, river by river, cape by cape, harbor by harbor. Each expedition extended the known world only a little beyond the previous one. By the 1440s, Portuguese ships reached regions around the Senegal River and Gambia. Trade expanded rapidly. Gold attracted enormous attention. Ivory proved profitable. Pepper and other commodities entered Portuguese markets. But another commerce emerged alongside these exchanges, one that would become among the darkest chapters in world history. From the earliest decades of Portuguese expansion, some expeditions captured or purchased enslaved Africans. These men, women, and children were transported across the Atlantic to Portugal. By the mid-1440s, public slave auctions were already taking place in Lisbon. What began on a relatively limited scale would, over the following centuries, evolve into the vast Atlantic slave trade that forcibly displaced millions of Africans and permanently reshaped societies on multiple continents. Prince Henry himself benefited financially from this commerce. For generations, popular narratives portrayed him almost exclusively as a visionary explorer. Modern scholarship presents a more complete picture. His ambitions included geographical curiosity, commercial opportunity, religious expansion, political prestige, and direct participation in systems of exploitation that accompanied Portuguese exploration from an early stage. The Atlantic islands also became laboratories for colonial expansion. Madeira, reached by Portuguese navigators around 1419, soon attracted settlers. Its fertile volcanic soil proved ideal for agriculture. Forests were cleared, communities established, Sugar cultivation expanded. The Azores followed. These islands offered more than strategic ports. They became testing grounds for new methods of land management, plantation agriculture, and colonial administration. Increasingly, enslaved labor from Africa supported agricultural production. Techniques developed that would later be transferred on a much larger scale to Brazil. By the time Prince Henry died in 1460, Portugal still had not reached India. The southern tip of Africa remained undiscovered by Europeans. No Portuguese ship had yet entered the Indian Ocean. The greatest achievements still lay ahead, but something irreversible had happened. Portugal had changed the direction of its future. Its gaze no longer rested primarily upon the Iberian Peninsula. It faced the Atlantic, and beyond that vast horizon waited opportunities, conflicts, discoveries, empires, and consequences that would transform not only Portugal, but the history of the entire world. By the time Prince Henry died, the momentum he had helped create did not disappear with him. If anything, it accelerated. Portuguese exploration had already become a long-term project of the crown rather than the ambition of a single prince. Every successful voyage added another piece to an increasingly detailed map of the Atlantic coastline. Every captain returned with new observations about currents, winds, coastal peoples, and trading opportunities. Navigation was becoming more scientific. Shipbuilding continued to improve. The fear that had once surrounded the Atlantic slowly gave way to something even more powerful: confidence. The rulers who followed understood that exploration was no longer simply a matter of prestige. It had become a matter of national strategy. Portugal remained a relatively small kingdom with limited agricultural resources compared to many of its European neighbors. It could not hope to dominate Europe through population or land armies. Its greatest advantage lay at sea. During the reign of King Afonso V, Portuguese expeditions continued moving farther south along the African coast. The explorers reached the Gulf of Guinea, an area whose climate, geography, and commercial networks differed greatly from anything previously encountered by Europeans. Here they established trading relationships with African kingdoms that already possessed sophisticated political systems and long-distance commercial connections extending deep into the continent. Contrary to many older European accounts, West Africa was not an isolated or undeveloped region waiting to be discovered. It contained prosperous states, established markets, experienced merchants, and complex diplomatic traditions. Gold from inland regions had reached Mediterranean markets for centuries before the Portuguese arrived. The Portuguese were entering an existing commercial world rather than creating one from nothing. Their arrival, nevertheless, altered that world. Portuguese merchants increasingly sought direct access to African products that had previously reached Europe through multiple intermediaries. Gold was especially valuable. European economies relied heavily upon precious metals for coinage, and fresh supplies strengthened royal finances. Ivory also attracted buyers. Pepper from parts of West Africa entered European markets. Gradually, enslaved people became an ever larger component of Portuguese commercial activity. As exploration expanded, the crown began experimenting with new methods of financing these expensive voyages. Rather than personally funding every expedition, the monarchy sometimes leased exploration rights to private merchants. One of the most significant examples was Fernão Gomes. In the early 1470s, Gomes received rights to explore portions of the African coast in exchange for annual payments to the crown and commitments to continue expanding Portuguese knowledge of the region. His expeditions reached areas corresponding to present-day Ghana. There they encountered some of the richest gold-producing regions known to Europeans. The Portuguese called the area the Gold Coast. The name reflected exactly what had captured their attention. The wealth generated from these commercial contacts strengthened Lisbon's position within European trade and demonstrated that exploration could produce enormous financial rewards. Yet despite these successes, one objective remained unfinished: India. The dream persisted because spices remained among the most valuable commodities in Europe. Pepper-preserved food, cinnamon-flavored meals, cloves, nutmeg, and mace were prized luxuries. Silks, porcelain, gemstones, and fine textiles arriving from Asia commanded extraordinary prices. Almost all of these products passed through commercial networks controlled by Muslim merchants across the Indian Ocean and Middle East before reaching Mediterranean traders, such as Venice and Genoa. Portugal wanted something revolutionary: a direct sea route. If Portuguese ships could sail around Africa and reach India without relying upon established overland routes, they could transform international commerce. The task eventually fell under one of Portugal's most capable monarchs, King João II. Ascending the throne in 1481, João II approached exploration with remarkable determination. He reorganized navigation, improved cartography, collected reports from returning captains, strengthened royal oversight. He understood that information itself had become one of Portugal's most valuable resources. Every coastline, carefully recorded, represented strategic knowledge unavailable to competitors. The king also encouraged the use of stone markers known as padros. These monuments, carved from limestone and bearing the Portuguese royal arms, were erected along newly reached coastlines. They announced Portuguese presence, commemorated voyages, and served as physical symbols of royal claims. In 1487, João II commissioned one of the most important expeditions in the history of exploration. Its commander was Bartolomeu Dias. Dias departed with 3 ships. His mission was clear: go farther south than anyone before him. Continue until either the coastline ended or the ocean itself proved impossible to navigate. The voyage became one of extraordinary hardship. Storms battered the fleet. Powerful winds pushed the ships far from the African coast. For days, perhaps longer, the sailors could no longer see land. Instead of turning immediately back, Dias continued sailing. Eventually, when the weather improved, he steered eastward expecting to find Africa once again. Only then did the astonishing realization emerge. The coastline appeared to his north, not his south. Without intending to do so, the expedition had sailed around the southern tip of Africa. For the first time in recorded history, Europeans had demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean connected directly to the waters leading toward the Indian Ocean. The geographical implications were immense. Africa could be circumnavigated. India was reachable by sea. The dream that had guided decades of Portuguese exploration was no longer theoretical. On the return journey, Dias encountered the southern cape itself. Because of the violent weather experienced there, he reportedly named it the Cape of Storms. King João II preferred another name, the Cape of Good Hope. The new name reflected not meteorology, but optimism, hope. Because beyond this cape lay the possibility of Asia. Dias did not continue all the way to India. His exhausted crew insisted upon returning home. Food supplies had diminished. The voyage had already exceeded previous expeditions by enormous distances. Nevertheless, the essential discovery had been made. Only one final step remained. Someone had to complete the journey. Meanwhile, events elsewhere in Europe increased the urgency. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean while sailing under the Spanish crown. Believing he had reached islands near Asia, Columbus unintentionally revealed continents previously unknown to Europeans. Spain and Portugal suddenly found themselves competing for influence across oceans neither fully understood. To prevent conflict, the two kingdoms negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. With papal approval, an imaginary line was drawn through the Atlantic. Lands east of the line would belong, in principle, to Portugal. Lands west would belong to Spain. Neither side understood the full geography of the globe. Neither knew that this agreement would later place part of South America, future Brazil, within Portugal's sphere. The treaty became one of history's most consequential diplomatic agreements. When King Manuel I inherited the Portuguese throne in 1495, he embraced the mission of reaching India. His choice to lead the expedition fell upon Vasco da Gama. Although not yet famous, da Gama possessed experience, noble status, and the confidence of the crown. In July 1497, first ships departed Lisbon. The voyage followed routes established by earlier explorers down the African coast before turning toward the Cape of Good Hope. Unlike previous expeditions, however, da Gama intended not merely to prove that the route existed. He intended to finish it. The fleet rounded the Cape successfully. It then proceeded northward along Africa's eastern coastline. Here the Portuguese entered a very different commercial world. Ports such as Mozambique, Mombasa, and Malindi formed part of a sophisticated maritime network linking East Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. These cities were prosperous. Their merchants spoke multiple languages. Islam played a central cultural and commercial role. Oceanic navigation, based upon seasonal monsoon winds, had connected these regions for centuries. The Portuguese were newcomers. In several ports, relations proved tense. Local rulers often viewed the strangers cautiously. Some suspected they were pirates. Others hoped they might become useful commercial partners. Diplomacy was complicated by language barriers and unfamiliar customs. The expedition's fortunes improved significantly at Malindi. There, local authorities assisted da Gama by providing an experienced pilot familiar with navigation across the Indian Ocean. The exact identity of this pilot remains debated among historians. Traditional accounts once credited the famous Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, but modern scholarship generally questions that claim. Whoever the pilot was, the guidance proved invaluable. Using established knowledge of seasonal winds, the Portuguese crossed the Indian Ocean. In May 1498, they reached Calicut on India's southwestern coast. After generations of planning, decades of exploration, thousands of miles sailed, the objective had finally been achieved. Europe and India were now connected directly by sea. The significance of this arrival cannot be overstated. It represented one of the great turning points in global history. Trade patterns that had existed for centuries would gradually change. Political rivalries would expand across oceans. European involvement in Asia entered an entirely new phase. Yet the first meeting did not unfold as the Portuguese expected. Calicut was already one of the great commercial cities of the Indian Ocean. Its ruler, known as the Zamorin, governed a wealthy port visited regularly by merchants from across Asia and the Middle East. The Portuguese assumed that reaching India automatically guaranteed favorable trade. Instead, they discovered they were merely one more group of foreign merchants seeking access to an already flourishing marketplace. The gifts da Gama presented to the Zamorin failed to impress. European textiles, hats, coral, and manufactured goods seemed relatively ordinary compared to the luxury products already circulating through Asian trade. Negotiations became difficult. Muslim merchants who already possessed established commercial relationships viewed the Portuguese as unwelcome competitors. Cultural misunderstandings complicated diplomacy further. Despite these challenges, da Gama succeeded in obtaining enough commercial agreements to justify the expedition. The return voyage proved brutal. Scurvy ravaged the crews. Many sailors died before reaching Portugal. Nevertheless, the profits generated by the cargo far exceeded the costs of the expedition. King Manuel celebrated the voyage as an extraordinary triumph. Portugal had accomplished what generations believed impossible. Now came an even greater challenge: maintaining the route. The crown moved quickly. Future expeditions became larger, better armed, more ambitious. The objective was no longer exploration. It was permanent participation in Indian Ocean commerce. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral departed with a substantial fleet. His mission was to strengthen Portuguese trade in India. Fate, however, intervened. Following Atlantic wind patterns intended to facilitate the journey around Africa, Cabral's fleet sailed much farther west than earlier expeditions. On April 22nd, 1500, land appeared. It was the eastern coastline of South America. Cabral claimed the territory for Portugal. Whether this westward movement resulted entirely from navigational strategy, weather conditions, or other factors continues to be discussed by historians. What remains certain is that the territory lay within Portugal's portion of the Treaty of Tordesillas. The land would eventually become Brazil. At first, however, Cabral remained focused on India. Continuing eastward, his fleet reached Calicut. Relations deteriorated rapidly. Violence erupted. Portuguese traders were killed. Cabral responded with naval bombardment. The confrontation demonstrated an important reality. Portugal intended not merely to participate peacefully in existing trade. Increasingly, it would seek military leverage to protect and expand its commercial interests. Leaving Calicut, Cabral established friendly relations with the rival port of Cochin. Political rivalries among Indian rulers created opportunities for Portuguese diplomacy. Rather than attempting to dominate the entire region immediately, Portugal often aligned itself with local powers whose interests temporarily coincided with its own. These alliances became a recurring feature of Portuguese expansion. The Crown soon recognized that distant commercial networks required stronger leadership. One man would shape Portuguese strategy in Asia more than any other. Afonso de Albuquerque, military commander, administrator, strategist, perhaps the most influential architect of Portugal's Eastern Empire. Albuquerque rejected the idea that Portugal needed vast inland territories. Portugal lacked the population to conquer enormous Asian kingdoms. Instead, he developed a different vision: control the sea. Occupy strategic ports. Dominat naho maritime passage. Influence commerce rather than territory. His approach reflected geographical reality. Trade across the Indian Ocean depended upon relatively limited maritime choke points. Control key locations. Control movement. Control movement. Influence trade. In 1510, Albuquerque captured Goa from the Sultanate of Bijapur. Situated on India's western coast, Goa possessed an excellent harbor, access to inland markets, and strategic importance for regional commerce. Unlike many earlier Portuguese possessions, Goa became far more than a trading station. It evolved into the administrative capital of Portuguese Asia. Churches rose beside government buildings. Merchants established warehouses. Missionaries founded schools. Officials coordinated activities stretching from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Goa would remain under Portuguese rule until 1961, making it one of the longest-held overseas territories in Portugal's history. Albuquerque next turned toward one of Asia's most important commercial centers, Malacca. Located on the Malay Peninsula, the city controlled the narrow strait linking the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. Merchants from China, India, Arabia, Persia, and Southeast Asia converged there. Whoever controlled Malacca possessed influence over one of the busiest maritime crossroads in the world. In 1511, Portuguese forces captured the city. The victory opened access to the Spice Islands, source of cloves, nutmeg, and mace. These commodities generated enormous profits in European markets. The Portuguese network continued expanding. Albuquerque eventually secured Hormuz near the entrance to the Persian Gulf. With Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz under Portuguese control, a remarkable strategic triangle had emerged. Instead of conquering entire civilizations, Portugal controlled gateways. Ships passing through key routes increasingly encountered Portuguese officials. Taxes, inspections, military patrols. The system became known as the Estado de India. It was unlike previous empires. Its strength depended upon harbors rather than vast inland provinces. Its power floated upon the sea. The Estado de India represented something the world had never seen before. Portugal had neither the population nor the resources to conquer the great civilizations of Asia outright. It could not realistically occupy the vast kingdoms of India, the enormous bureaucracy of Ming China, or the countless islands of Southeast Asia. Instead, Portuguese rulers pursued a different strategy. They aimed to dominate the arteries of commerce rather than the continents themselves. Whoever controlled the major ports, the strategic harbors, and the narrow sea lanes could influence trade flowing across thousands of miles of ocean. It was an ambitious vision, and for a time, it worked remarkably well. From Goa, Portuguese governors coordinated fleets that sailed in every direction. Some moved west toward East Africa and the Persian Gulf. Others continued east into waters that few Europeans had ever entered. Their destination was the legendary source of some of the world's most valuable spices. European consumers had long prized cloves, nutmeg, and mace. These spices were rare, expensive, and enormously profitable. Yet very few Europeans knew exactly where they originated. Goods changed hands repeatedly as they traveled through Asian trading networks before finally reaching Mediterranean merchants and then European buyers. The Portuguese hoped to bypass nearly every intermediary by reaching the source itself. Their search led them toward the Maluku Islands, often called the Spice Islands, in present-day Indonesia. These islands were geographically remote, but economically significant beyond their size. Clove trees grew naturally in only a handful of locations. Nutmeg was similarly concentrated in a limited area. Whoever secured reliable access to these products could earn fortunes. Portuguese expeditions arrived during the early decades of the 16th century. Rather than conquering the islands outright, they negotiated with local rulers, established commercial agreements where possible, and constructed modest fortified positions. Political conditions varied from island to island. Some leaders welcomed Portuguese trade in hopes of strengthening their own positions against rivals. Others resisted outside influence. Local alliances shifted frequently, requiring constant diplomatic adjustment. Portuguese naval power gave them important advantages, but it did not guarantee complete control. Distance alone created enormous logistical challenges. Every reinforcement had to travel thousands of miles from Lisbon. Storms, disease, shipwrecks, and changing political circumstances constantly threatened communication across the empire. Even so, Portugal had succeeded in extending its commercial network farther east than any previous European kingdom. Beyond Southeast Asia lay an even greater prize: China. For Europeans of the 16th century, China possessed an almost mythical reputation. Travelers' accounts described immense cities, sophisticated government, advanced craftsmanship, and luxury goods unlike anything produced in Europe. Chinese silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and fine metalwork commanded high prices across Asia. The Ming Dynasty tightly regulated foreign commerce. Unlike many regions where Portuguese ships had arrived, China already possessed a powerful centralized state capable of deciding exactly how and when foreigners could trade. Foreign merchants generally operated within carefully supervised systems. Unauthorized activity was viewed with suspicion. The first Portuguese contacts reflected these difficulties. In 1513, Jorge Alvarez became one of the earliest known Portuguese explorers to reach southern China. His arrival demonstrated that direct maritime contact was possible, yet establishing stable diplomatic relations proved far more difficult than reaching the coastline itself. Misunderstandings quickly emerged. Some Portuguese captains behaved aggressively. Others became involved in unauthorized trading. Chinese officials received reports of piracy, violence, and illegal activity associated with certain Portuguese visitors. These incidents damaged trust. One Portuguese embassy sent to the Ming court failed disastrously. Several members of the mission never returned. For years, meaningful commercial relations appeared uncertain. Yet practical considerations gradually encouraged compromise. Chinese authorities recognized that regulated trade could be beneficial if carefully supervised. Portuguese merchants likewise understood that cooperation offered greater rewards than confrontation. The result emerged in 1557. The Portuguese obtained permission to establish themselves at Macau. Unlike Goa or Malacca, Macau was not seized through military conquest. Instead, it developed through negotiation with Chinese authorities under arrangements that evolved over time. Portugal paid annual rent, accepted various limitations, and operated within conditions established by the Ming government. Macau became one of the most remarkable cities in the Portuguese Empire. Chinese and Portuguese communities lived side by side. Catholic churches rose near traditional Chinese neighborhoods. European merchants, Chinese traders, missionaries, sailors, interpreters, scholars, and artisans all contributed to its distinctive character. It became an essential gateway connecting China with a wider Portuguese commercial network. Silk flowed outward, silver flowed inward. Ideas traveled in both directions. Macau would remain under Portuguese administration until 1999, making it the final overseas territory of the Portuguese Empire. Not far beyond China lay another country that fascinated Portuguese merchants: Japan. When Portuguese traders first reached the Japanese archipelago during the 1540s, they entered a society experiencing profound political change. The country was divided among competing regional rulers known as daimyo during the Sengoku period, an era often described as Japan's age of warring states. Political fragmentation created opportunities. Different daimyos sought military advantages over their rivals. Portuguese merchants happened to carry something that immediately attracted attention: firearms. Although primitive guns already existed elsewhere in Asia, the matchlock arquebus introduced by the Portuguese proved highly effective. Japanese craftsmen quickly studied the weapons, reproduced them domestically, and improved manufacturing techniques. Within decades, firearms played an increasingly important role in Japanese warfare. Trade expanded rapidly. Portuguese ships carried Chinese silk to Japan. Japanese silver traveled in the opposite direction. European manufactured goods entered Asian markets. Asian luxury products flowed toward Europe. The commercial triangle linking Macau, Japan, and Southeast Asia became one of the most profitable components of Portugal's Eastern network. Commerce was accompanied by religion. The Portuguese crown viewed missionary activity as an essential responsibility accompanying imperial expansion. Catholic missionaries traveled aboard many fleets. Among them, one name became especially influential: Francis Xavier. A founding member of the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, Xavier reached Goa in 1542 before continuing his missionary journeys across Asia. He preached in India. He visited Southeast Asia. Then, in 1549, he arrived in Japan. His approach differed from many earlier missionaries. Rather than simply preaching through translators, Xavier and later Jesuits devoted considerable effort to understanding local languages and customs. They recognized that meaningful communication required cultural adaptation. Some Japanese communities welcomed these new teachings. Several daimyo converted to Christianity, partly from genuine religious conviction and partly because closer relations with Portuguese merchants offered economic advantages. Churches appeared. Schools were founded. Japanese Christians formed growing congregations, particularly in Kyushu. For several decades, Christianity expanded more successfully in Japan than many Europeans had imagined possible. Yet success eventually produced new anxieties. As powerful leaders such as Toyotomi Hideyoshi and later Tokugawa Ieyasu gradually unified Japan, they became increasingly suspicious of foreign influence. Christian communities maintained ties with overseas missionaries. European merchants possessed growing economic influence. Political leaders worried that religion might become a pathway for foreign interference. Restrictions gradually increased. Missionaries faced expulsion. Conversions became illegal. Persecutions followed. Thousands of Japanese Christians continued practicing their faith in secret for generations. preserving traditions despite severe repression. Meanwhile, Portuguese influence in Japan steadily declined. The Tokugawa shogunate ultimately restricted European trade almost entirely. The Dutch retained limited commercial access under tightly controlled conditions. Portugal lost one of its most promising Asian markets. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, Portuguese fortunes proved mixed. Commercial contacts extended into regions corresponding to modern Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Missionaries established communities. Merchants negotiated agreements. Individual Portuguese adventurers sometimes entered local service as soldiers or advisors. Yet lasting territorial control remained limited. Strong regional kingdoms, established political systems, and growing competition from other European powers prevented Portugal from dominating mainland Southeast Asia. Still, the cultural traces remained. Portuguese loanwords entered several Asian languages. Architectural influences survived in coastal communities. Catholic congregations established during this period continued worshiping long after Portuguese political influence faded. By the middle of the 16th century, Portugal's network stretched farther than anyone had imagined possible only a century earlier. From Lisbon, ships sailed around Africa. They reached India, continued through Southeast Asia, stopped in Macau, traded with Japan. Few, if any, states before Portugal had maintained such an extensive maritime system connecting so many distant regions. Yet while Asia captured much of Europe's imagination, another development was quietly transforming Portugal's future. It had begun almost accidentally. When Pedro Álvares Cabral sighted the Brazilian coast in 1500, the discovery initially attracted less attention than India. After all, Brazil lacked established cities like Calicut. It possessed no obvious spice markets comparable to Southeast Asia. There were no known silk industries, no famous centers of porcelain production. For several decades, Portuguese activity remained relatively limited. The first commercially significant product proved to be Brazil wood, a tree whose reddish dye was highly valued in Europe. Portuguese traders exchanged metal tools, textiles, and other goods with indigenous communities in return for assistance cutting and transporting the timber. These early encounters varied greatly. Some involved cooperation, others involved coercion. Different indigenous peoples responded differently depending upon local circumstances. Brazil itself was home to hundreds of distinct indigenous societies long before Europeans arrived, each possessing its own language, customs, political organization, and relationship with neighboring peoples. European observers often misunderstood this diversity. Gradually, Portuguese interest deepened. Attention shifted toward agriculture. One crop promised exceptional profits: sugar. Sugar was already familiar to Portuguese planters. They had successfully cultivated it on Madeira and other Atlantic islands. Brazil's tropical climate appeared even more favorable. Large plantations soon spread across portions of the northeastern coastline. The demands of sugar production transformed Portuguese colonial policy. Permanent settlement expanded. Colonists arrived in greater numbers. The crown sought stronger administrative control. In the 1530s, Portugal introduced the captaincy system. Brazil's coastline was divided into long hereditary grants extending inland from the Atlantic. Individual captains received responsibility for settlement, defense, and economic development. Some captaincies failed almost immediately. Disease, financial shortages, conflict, geographic isolation, all contributed to disappointing results. Others prospered, particularly Pernambuco and São Vicente. Recognizing the need for stronger coordination, the Portuguese crown established a centralized colonial government in 1549. Tomé de Souza became Brazil's first governor-general. He founded Salvador, which served as the colonial capital for more than 2 centuries. From Salvador, royal officials coordinated administration, military defense, taxation, and expanding settlement. Churches appeared alongside government buildings. Ports expanded. Fortifications protected the coastline against rival European powers. Missionaries traveled inland seeking converts among indigenous communities. As sugar production increased, one problem became increasingly urgent: labor. Sugar plantations required enormous numbers of workers. Initially, Portuguese colonists attempted to force many indigenous peoples into labor. Resistance proved widespread. Communities fled into the interior. Disease introduced from Europe devastated indigenous populations who possessed no previous exposure to illnesses such as smallpox and measles. Mortality reached catastrophic levels in many regions. The combination of resistance, demographic collapse, and practical difficulties led plantation owners toward another labor system. They increasingly relied upon enslaved Africans. Portugal already possessed commercial networks along the West African coast. What had begun during the 15th century now expanded dramatically. Ports such as Elmina, Luanda, and others became major centers within an expanding Atlantic slave trade. It is important to recognize that this system involved multiple participants across different regions. Some African rulers and merchants captured prisoners during wars or raids and sold them into slavery. Portuguese traders purchased many of these captives before transporting them across the Atlantic under horrific conditions. The existence of African participation in the trade does not diminish Portugal's central responsibility for building, expanding, and profiting from the transatlantic system. European demand drove its enormous scale. Portuguese commercial networks helped sustain it for centuries. The Middle Passage became one of history's greatest human tragedies. Millions of Africans were forced aboard crowded ships. Disease spread rapidly. Violence was constant. Families were permanently separated. Many never survived the crossing. Those who did faced lives of forced labor under brutal conditions. Brazil eventually received more enslaved Africans than any other destination in the Atlantic world. Their labor became fundamental to the colony's economy. Sugar plantations generated immense wealth, but that prosperity rested upon exploitation of extraordinary human suffering. Even under such oppressive circumstances, African cultures endured. Languages, music, religious traditions, agricultural knowledge, cuisine, craftsmanship. These influences blended with Portuguese and indigenous traditions, helping create the cultural foundations of modern Brazil. The Portuguese Empire was becoming more than a network of distant trading posts. It was evolving into an interconnected Atlantic and Indian Ocean system linking Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Goods moved constantly. People moved willingly or by force. Ideas traveled with merchants and missionaries. Diseases crossed oceans. Languages mixed. Religion spread. The first truly global empire was taking shape. Yet the greater Portugal's success became the more attention it attracted from ambitious rivals. The extraordinary wealth flowing into Lisbon did not go unnoticed. Other European kingdoms were watching closely, and before long, they would begin challenging Portuguese dominance on nearly every ocean. By the middle of the 16th century, Portugal had accomplished something unprecedented. In little more than a century, a kingdom with a population of only around 1 to 2 million people had established a chain of settlements, fortresses, trading posts, and colonial territories stretching from the Atlantic coast of South America to the shores of East Asia. Portuguese ships regularly crossed oceans that only a few generations earlier had seemed impossibly distant. Lisbon had become one of Europe's busiest ports. Exotic cargoes arrived almost continuously. Pepper from India, cloves from the Maluku Islands, cinnamon from Ceylon, Chinese silk, Japanese silver, Brazilian sugar, African ivory, precious stones from Asia, fine porcelain, rare woods, textiles unlike anything woven in Europe. To visitors arriving in Lisbon, the city appeared transformed. Warehouses overflowed with goods from across the world. Foreign merchants negotiated contracts in dozens of languages. African sailors unloaded cargo beside Italian bankers. Jewish financiers worked alongside Flemish traders. Arab interpreters, Indian merchants, and European diplomats crossed paths in crowded streets where the smell of spices mixed with the salt air blowing in from the Tagus River. The Portuguese monarchy embraced this image enthusiastically. King Manuel, I adopted increasingly elaborate royal titles reflecting the empire's growing reach. Official ceremonies celebrated Portugal not merely as another European kingdom, but as the leading maritime power of its age. Maps displayed newly charted coastlines. Chroniclers described distant lands with wonder. Court artists depicted exotic animals, foreign ambassadors, and luxurious products arriving from every direction. Yet behind this remarkable prosperity lay enormous practical challenges. The empire existed across extraordinary distances. A message sent from Lisbon to Goa could require many months to arrive. Communication with Macau took even longer. Storms delayed fleets. Ships disappeared without explanation. Scurvy, disease, piracy, and shipwreck remained constant dangers. Even under ideal conditions, coordinating policy across 4 continents was immensely difficult. Portugal also faced a simple mathematical problem. Its empire was expanding much faster than its population. There were never enough officials, never enough soldiers, never enough experienced sailors, never enough administrators. In many places, Portuguese authority depended less upon overwhelming military strength than upon carefully negotiated alliances, commercial agreements, and the willingness of local rulers to cooperate. This reality shaped the empire's character. Unlike later colonial empires that often sought direct territorial rule over vast inland regions, Portugal generally concentrated on strategic coastal positions. Goa, Malacca, Hormuz, Mozambique Island, Sofala, Mombasa, Macau. These locations formed a chain rather than a continuous territory. Ships connected them. The sea itself became the empire's highway. Maintaining that highway required more than commerce. It required military force. Portuguese warships patrolled important routes throughout the Indian Ocean. Merchant vessels were often required to carry official licenses known as cartazes. Without these permits, ships risked being stopped, searched, confiscated, or even attacked. The cartaz system allowed Portuguese authorities to monitor commercial traffic and collect revenue, while attempting to enforce their monopoly over key maritime routes. To merchants already active within the Indian Ocean for centuries, this represented an extraordinary change. Arab, Persian, Gujarati, Malay, and other trading communities had long operated within commercial systems based upon negotiation, regional diplomacy, and established customs. Now, a European naval power sought to regulate movement across waters it had only recently entered. Resistance was inevitable. Some merchants ignored Portuguese regulations. Others sought protection from regional rulers. Powerful states soon recognized that Portugal's growing influence threatened existing balances of power. Among the most formidable of these rivals was the Ottoman Empire. During the 16th century, the Ottomans controlled vast territories stretching across southeastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. They possessed experienced armies, sophisticated administration, and a powerful navy. Portuguese expansion into the Indian Ocean inevitably brought the two empires into competition. The Ottomans sought to preserve traditional commercial routes, linking Asia with the eastern Mediterranean. Portugal sought to bypass them. Naval confrontations followed. Control of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf became matters of strategic importance. Although Portugal achieved notable victories at sea, it never succeeded in completely excluding Ottoman influence from the region. Instead, a prolonged balance emerged in which neither side fully dominated the other. Competition extended beyond Muslim powers. New European rivals were also beginning to emerge. Spain remained Portugal's closest competitor in overseas expansion. Although the Treaty of Tordesillas had divided much of the non-European world between them on paper, reality proved more complicated. Neither kingdom fully understood global geography when the treaty was signed. As exploration continued, disputes periodically arose regarding the precise location of the dividing line and the ownership of newly encountered territories. Despite occasional tensions, Portugal and Spain generally avoided direct, large-scale warfare overseas during the early decades of expansion. Their relationship changed dramatically through dynastic events later in the century. But before that transformation, another force was reshaping the empire from within: religion. From the earliest stages of Portuguese overseas expansion, Christianity had accompanied exploration. Priests traveled aboard many expeditions. Churches appeared soon after permanent settlements. Royal charters frequently described the spread of Christianity as one of the principal purposes of imperial activity. This reflected genuine religious conviction among many participants. At the same time, missionary work often became closely connected with political authority. Conversion could strengthen alliances. Churches reinforced Portuguese cultural influence. Religious institutions sometimes served administrative functions in areas where civil government remained limited. Among all missionary organizations, none became more influential than the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits. Founded in 1540 during the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits emphasized education, scholarship, discipline, and missionary work. Their members spread rapidly throughout the Portuguese Empire. Goa became one of their principal centers. There they established colleges that attracted students from India, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Subjects included theology, philosophy, mathematics, languages, rhetoric, and astronomy. Missionaries learned local languages whenever possible. Some translated religious texts. Others produced dictionaries and grammars that remain valuable historical sources today. The Jesuits often displayed remarkable intellectual curiosity about the societies they encountered. At the same time, their ultimate goal remained conversion to Christianity. One missionary came to symbolize this global effort more than any other. Francis Xavier. His travels carried him from Lisbon to Goa, through southern India, into Southeast Asia, and eventually Japan. He preached tirelessly. He baptized converts. He established missions wherever opportunities arose. His letters, widely circulated throughout Europe, inspired generations of future missionaries while also shaping European understanding of Asia. Francis Xavier hoped eventually to enter China as well. He believed that if the emperor embraced Christianity, many others might follow. He never reached the imperial court. Instead, he died in 1552 on Shangchuan Island while waiting for an opportunity to enter the mainland. His death marked the end of one remarkable life, but not the end of the missionary movement he helped inspire. In many parts of Asia, Christian communities established during the Portuguese period survived long after Portuguese political influence declined. Religion also transformed Portuguese activities in Africa. The Kingdom of Congo provides one of the most fascinating examples. Located in West Central Africa, Congo possessed an organized monarchy, sophisticated political institutions, and extensive regional influence before sustained Portuguese contact. Diplomatic relations developed during the late 15th century. Members of the Congolese royal family converted to Christianity. The King Nzinga Nkuwu accepted baptism and took the Christian name Joao. His successor, Afonso I, became an especially enthusiastic supporter of Christian institutions. Churches were built. Clergy received education. Letters exchanged between Congo and Portugal reveal active diplomatic engagement rather than simple domination by one side over the other. Yet cooperation also generated tensions. As the Atlantic slave trade expanded, increasing numbers of Congolese subjects were captured and sold into slavery, often through conflicts involving neighboring states or internal political struggles. King Afonso repeatedly complained to Portuguese authorities about illegal slave trading that undermined his kingdom. His correspondence illustrates the growing contradiction at the heart of the Portuguese Empire. Missionaries preached Christian brotherhood. Merchants pursued enormous profits through human trafficking. These two realities often existed side by side. Nowhere did these contradictions become more visible than in Brazil. Jesuit missionaries established villages known as aldeias. Their stated purpose was to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity while introducing European agricultural methods and social organization. Some missionaries sincerely attempted to protect indigenous communities from enslavement by colonists. Figures such as Manuel de Nóbrega and José de Anchieta argued repeatedly that indigenous peoples should not be treated as property. These efforts occasionally brought the Jesuits into conflict with settlers who demanded labor for plantations. At the same time, missionary activity also sought to transform indigenous cultures fundamentally. Traditional religious practices were discouraged or prohibited. European customs became the standard. Christian instruction formed the basis of education. Protection and cultural assimilation often occurred simultaneously. African communities experienced similar complexities. Most enslaved Africans arriving in Brazil were baptized, at least formally. Catholic brotherhoods provided spaces where black communities could organize religious and social life. Over time, African beliefs blended with Catholic traditions in ways neither Portuguese officials nor missionaries had originally intended. Religious syncretism emerged. Catholic saints became associated with African spiritual figures. Traditional music accompanied Christian festivals. New forms of worship developed that reflected both African heritage and colonial realities. These traditions continue influencing Brazilian culture today. Throughout the empire, churches multiplied. Magnificent cathedrals rose in Goa. Mission stations appeared in Angola. Convents were founded in Brazil. Schools educated colonial elites. Religious festivals filled city streets with elaborate processions. The church became one of the empire's most visible institutions. It also became one of its wealthiest. Large estates, donations, commercial activities, and royal patronage provided considerable resources. The Portuguese crown exercised significant influence over ecclesiastical appointments through a system known as the Padroado Real, or royal patronage. This arrangement allowed the monarchy to nominate bishops and oversee many church affairs within overseas territories. Religion and government therefore remained deeply intertwined. The cross and the crown advanced together. Yet despite apparent strength, warning signs were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Corruption spread within colonial administration. Some officials used distant postings primarily for personal enrichment. Merchants smuggled goods to avoid taxes. Governors sometimes ignored instructions from Lisbon when local circumstances made compliance inconvenient. Distance complicated oversight. Communication delays encouraged autonomy. In Asia, Portuguese authority increasingly depended upon local Portuguese-born communities, mixed heritage families, and long-established merchant networks rather than direct supervision from Europe. These communities developed identities distinct from Portugal itself. They spoke Portuguese while also adopting local languages. They married across cultural boundaries. They combined architectural styles, culinary traditions, and social customs from multiple continents. The empire was creating entirely new societies. Meanwhile, outside Portugal, powerful observers studied Portuguese success carefully. Dutch merchants, English navigators, French investors, Italian financiers. They all recognized that enormous wealth flowed through Portuguese routes. Many asked the same question: why should Portugal control these profits alone? By the final decades of the 16th century, new maritime powers were investing heavily in navigation, shipbuilding, cartography, and overseas commerce. Portugal's early lead remained impressive, but it would not remain uncontested forever. At the very moment when the empire reached its greatest geographical extent, the political stability that had made such expansion possible was about to face its greatest crisis. It would begin with the death of a young king on a distant battlefield in North Africa, and the consequences would reshape the Portuguese Empire for generations. In the late 16th century, Portugal appeared outwardly stronger than ever. Its ships still crossed the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Its merchants continued trading in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Brazil. Lisbon remained one of Europe's busiest ports, and the Portuguese language could now be heard in marketplaces separated by thousands of miles. Yet beneath this image of confidence serious vulnerabilities had begun to emerge. The empire was expensive to maintain. Garrisons had to be supplied across enormous distances. Fleets required constant repairs. Competition was increasing. Perhaps most importantly, Portugal's remarkable overseas expansion had not been matched by demographic growth. The kingdom simply did not have enough people to govern such a vast network comfortably. These long-term pressures became far more dangerous because of an unexpected political crisis. King Sebastian had come to the throne as a child after the death of his grandfather, King John III. As he grew older, he developed a powerful fascination with crusading ideals. He admired stories of medieval Christian victories and dreamed of restoring Portuguese influence in North Africa. Many advisors urged caution. Portugal's resources were already stretched across 4 continents. The empire generated enormous wealth, but it also demanded constant attention. A major military adventure carried obvious risks. Sebastian ignored those warnings. In 1578, he personally led a large Portuguese expedition into Morocco. His objective was to support a claimant to the Moroccan throne and strengthen Portuguese influence in North Africa. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, also known as the Battle of the Three Kings. The outcome was disastrous. The Portuguese army suffered a crushing defeat. Thousands of soldiers were killed. Many nobles were captured and later ransomed at enormous cost. King Sebastian himself disappeared during the fighting. His body was never conclusively identified. The uncertainty surrounding his death produced one of the most remarkable episodes in Portuguese history. Because no universally accepted body was recovered, rumors spread that Sebastian had survived and would someday return to restore Portugal's greatness. This belief, known as Sebastianism, persisted for centuries and influenced Portuguese political culture, literature, and popular imagination long after the historical king was gone. But whatever the legends suggested, the practical consequences were immediate. Sebastian had left no children. Portugal sada nefastas existem crisis. The throne briefly passed to Cardinal Henry, Sebastian's elderly great-uncle. Henry had spent most of his life within the church and had no legitimate heirs. His reign lasted only 2 years before his death in 1580. Once again, the kingdom lacked a clear successor. Several claimants emerged. Among them was Antonio, Prior of Crado, an illegitimate member of the royal family who enjoyed support from many Portuguese who wished to preserve complete national independence. Another claimant possessed an even stronger dynastic argument. Philip II of Spain. Philip was the grandson of King Manuel I of Portugal through his mother, Isabella of Portugal. Legally, his claim carried considerable weight. Politically, however, many Portuguese feared what his accession might mean. Spain already possessed an immense empire stretching across Europe and the Americas. Would Portugal simply disappear into it? Philip moved quickly. Spanish forces entered Portugal. At the Battle of Alcántara, Antonio's supporters were defeated. In 1581, the Cortes of Tomar formally recognized Philip as King Philip I of Portugal. The agreement that followed is often misunderstood. Portugal did not immediately become a province of Spain. Instead, the two kingdoms entered what historians call the Iberian Union. The crowns were united under a single monarch. The states themselves technically remained separate. Portugal retained its own laws, its own currency, its own legal system, its own colonial administration, its own overseas institutions. Portuguese officials were, in theory, supposed to continue governing Portuguese possessions. Philip promised to respect these arrangements. Initially, many members of the Portuguese elite accepted the new reality. Civil war had been avoided. The empire remained formally intact. Trade continued. For a short time, the transition appeared manageable. Yet the union carried consequences that few fully anticipated. Spain's enemies soon became Portugal's enemies. No development proved more damaging than Spain's conflict with the Dutch Republic. The Dutch had rebelled against Spanish rule during the 80 Years' War. As fighting expanded, Dutch merchants and naval commanders searched for ways to weaken the Spanish monarchy economically. Portuguese overseas possessions suddenly became attractive targets. The Dutch reasoned that if Portugal and Spain shared the same monarch, attacking Portuguese trade would indirectly damage Spanish power. From their perspective, Portuguese colonies had become legitimate military objectives. This marked the beginning of one of the greatest challenges the Portuguese Empire would ever face. Unlike earlier rivals, the Dutch possessed impressive commercial organization. In 1602, they established the Verenigde Oost-Indisch Company, better known as the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. The company was unlike any commercial enterprise Europe had previously seen. It combined private investment with government authority. It could build forts, maintain armies, operate navies, negotiate treaties, declare war, issue currency. Its resources rivaled those of many European states. The Dutch did not simply want access to Asian trade. They intended to dominate it. Portuguese monopolies became their primary targets. Dutch fleets entered the Indian Ocean in increasing numbers. One by one, Portuguese positions came under pressure. Commercial routes, once considered secure, became battlefields. Merchants who had traded peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves navigating waters patrolled by competing European navies. The struggle extended across thousands of miles. In Southeast Asia, the Dutch concentrated on controlling the spice trade. They understood that whoever dominated cloves and nutmeg would enjoy enormous commercial advantages. Portuguese influence in the Maluku Islands steadily weakened as Dutch forces formed alliances with local rulers and established stronger military positions. Then came one of the empire's greatest losses. Malacca. Captured by Afonso de Albuquerque in 1511, the city had served for more than a century as one of Portugal's most valuable strategic possessions. In 1641, after a prolonged siege, Dutch forces captured the city. The fall of Malacca represented far more than the loss of a single port. It signaled the end of Portuguese dominance over one of Asia's most important maritime crossroads. Trade patterns shifted. Dutch influence expanded. Portuguese prestige suffered. Elsewhere, events unfolded with similar intensity. Hormuz, guarding the entrance to the Persian Gulf, had long served as another cornerstone of Portuguese strategy. Its location allowed Portuguese fleets to influence commerce between Persia, Arabia, and India. Yet local opposition had never disappeared. In 1622, Persian forces under Shah Abbas I, supported by ships from the English East India Company, successfully expelled the Portuguese. The alliance reflected changing realities. England, like the Netherlands, increasingly viewed Portuguese commercial monopolies as obstacles rather than partners. The loss of Hormuz weakened Portugal's ability to influence trade throughout the Persian Gulf. The Atlantic world proved equally dangerous. In 1621, the Dutch established a second major corporation, the Dutch West India Company. With a VOC focused primarily on Asia, the West India Company concentrated on the Atlantic. Its objectives included sugar, gold, and control over sections of the Atlantic slave trade. Dutch commanders soon attacked Portuguese possessions along the West African coast. In 1637, they captured Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana. For decades, Elmina had served as one of Portugal's most important African trading forts. Gold had flowed through its warehouses. Enslaved Africans had departed from its harbor. Its loss disrupted commercial systems Portugal had built over generations. Dutch forces also seized Luanda in Angola for several years. Because Angola had become one of the principal sources of enslaved labor for Brazilian plantations, the occupation threatened the economic foundations of Portuguese America. Perhaps nowhere did Dutch ambitions become more dramatic than in Brazil. In 1630, Dutch fleets attacked northeastern Brazil. They captured important cities, including Olinda and Recife. Rather than conducting brief raids, they intended to establish a permanent colony. They called it New Holland. For more than 20 years, significant portions of northeastern Brazil remained under Dutch administration. One of the most interesting figures of this period was Johann Moritz of Nassau-Siegen, known in English as John Maurice of Nassau. Appointed governor of Dutch Brazil, he pursued policies that differed in several respects from earlier Portuguese administration. He encouraged scientific study. Artists documented local landscapes, plants, animals, and people with remarkable detail. Religious toleration proved broader than was common elsewhere during the period. Urban improvements were introduced in Recife. Although Dutch Brazil remained a colonial enterprise pursuing commercial profit, it also became an important center of scientific observation and artistic documentation. Many of the earliest detailed European depictions of Brazilian life date from this period. Yet Dutch control never became fully secure. Large numbers of Portuguese settlers remained loyal to the Portuguese crown. Luso-Brazilian landowners resisted foreign rule. Indigenous allies fought on different sides, depending upon local circumstances. Enslaved Africans also experienced the conflict in complex ways, sometimes escaping amid the chaos, sometimes being drawn into military campaigns. Gradually, organized resistance strengthened. After Portugal restored its independence from Spain, reclaiming Brazil became a national priority. Years of fighting followed. Finally, in 1654, Dutch forces surrendered Recife. Portuguese authority returned to northeastern Brazil. The victory proved enormously significant. Had Brazil remained permanently under Dutch rule, the later history of both Portugal and South America might have unfolded very differently. Brazil had become too important to lose. Its sugar plantations generated immense revenue. Its ports connected Atlantic commerce. Its growing population increasingly outweighed that of Portugal's Asian possessions. Recovering Brazil preserved the economic heart of the empire. Not every territory could be recovered. Across Asia, many Portuguese positions remained permanently lost. Dutch commercial power continued expanding. English influence steadily increased. The Portuguese Empire survived, but no longer occupied the commanding position it had enjoyed during the early 16th century. While external enemies challenged the empire abroad, dissatisfaction grew within Portugal itself. Many Portuguese nobles believed Spanish monarchs increasingly favored Castilian interests over Portuguese priorities. Taxes rose. Military resources were diverted towards Spanish wars. Portuguese merchants complained that their commerce suffered because of conflicts that had originated elsewhere. The promise that Portugal would remain fully autonomous under the Iberian Union seemed increasingly difficult to reconcile with political reality. By the late 1630s, opposition had become organized. The opportunity arrived during another crisis. Spain faced a major revolt in Catalonia. Its military resources were stretched thin. Portuguese conspirators recognized that Madrid might be unable to suppress another rebellion simultaneously. On the 1st of December, 1640, a carefully planned uprising unfolded in Lisbon. Supporters of Portuguese independence seized key government buildings. The Spanish governor was arrested. Almost immediately, the conspirators proclaimed João, Duke of Braganza, as King João IV of Portugal. The Braganza dynasty had begun. The restoration itself occurred with remarkable speed in Lisbon. Securing independence, however, proved far more difficult. Spain refused to recognize the new king. War followed. The Restoration War would continue for nearly 3 decades. Portugal once again faced the challenge that had shaped so much of its earlier history. It had to defend its independence against a larger and more powerful neighbor. The outcome would determine not only the future of Portugal itself, but also whether its global empire could continue to exist as an independent enterprise. When João IV was proclaimed king in December 1640, celebration spread quickly through much of Portugal. For many people, the restoration of an independent monarchy represented the end of 60 years of foreign dynastic rule. Yet those celebrations could not hide a difficult reality. Declaring independence was far easier than preserving it. Spain remained one of Europe's strongest military powers. It rejected the legitimacy of the Braganza dynasty and fully intended to bring Portugal back under Habsburg control. The struggle that followed became known as the Restoration War. It lasted from 1640 until 1668. Unlike a single continuous campaign, the conflict consisted of years of raids, sieges, frontier battles, diplomatic maneuvering, and periods of uneasy calm. Fighting concentrated largely along the border separating Portugal and Spain, but the consequences extended far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Every colony, every trading post, and every overseas possession depended upon the outcome. João IV understood immediately that Portugal could not rely solely upon military courage. The kingdom's population remained relatively small. Financial resources had already been strained by decades of war and commercial disruption. Victory would require diplomacy as much as battlefield success. One of Portugal's greatest advantages was the international situation. Spain faced multiple crises simultaneously. The 30 Years' War had consumed enormous resources. Conflicts with France continued. Rebellions erupted within parts of the Spanish monarchy itself. No empire, however large, possessed unlimited strength. Portugal s'offre à l'irrévérer possible. France, eager to weaken its Habsburg rival, offered support at various stages. England, Portugal's oldest diplomatic partner, gradually became increasingly important. The historic alliance, first established during the 14th century, once again proved valuable. When Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England in 1662, the marriage strengthened political cooperation between the two kingdoms. The agreement carried consequences that reached far beyond royal ceremony. As part of Catherine's dowry, Portugal transferred Bombay in India and Tangier in North Africa to England. At the time, these decisions reflected immediate diplomatic priorities rather than long-term imperial calculations. Portugal needed English military and political support against Spain. History would later show how significant those territorial transfers became. Bombay eventually developed into one of the British Empire's greatest commercial centers. At the time, however, Portugal's immediate concern was survival. Along the frontier, Portuguese commanders adopted practical strategies. Rather than seeking large offensive campaigns, they concentrated on defense. Fortifications were strengthened. Supply lines improved. Local geography was used to advantage. Spanish invasions repeatedly encountered determined resistance. Several battles proved especially important. The Battle of Ameixial in 1663 demonstrated that Portuguese forces could defeat larger Spanish armies under favorable conditions. 2 years later, the Battle of Montes Claros delivered another decisive Portuguese victory. By then, it was becoming increasingly clear that Spain faced diminishing prospects of restoring the Iberian Union through military force. Finally, in 1668, the Treaty of Lisbon formally ended the conflict. Spain recognized the independence of Portugal. The Braganza dynasty secured international legitimacy. For the second time in its history, Portugal had successfully defended its sovereignty against overwhelming odds. Yet victory came at a price. The empire emerging from the Restoration War differed greatly from the one inherited before the Iberian Union. Many Asian possessions have been lost permanently. Dutch commercial competition remained intense. English maritime influence continued expanding. The age when Portugal dominated global trade almost without challenge had passed. The question facing Lisbon was no longer how to expand endlessly. It was how to preserve what remained. The answer increasingly pointed toward one colony above all others: Brazil. For much of the 16th century, Brazil had been important. During the 17th century, it became indispensable. Sugar lay at the heart of this transformation. European demand continued growing. Although Caribbean plantations established by Britain, France, and the Netherlands increasingly entered the market, Brazilian sugar remained one of Portugal's greatest sources of wealth. Plantations spread across northeastern Brazil. Large estates dominated the landscape. Mills processed harvested cane into sugar for export. Ports such as Salvador and Recife became bustling commercial centers linking the Atlantic economy. This prosperity depended almost entirely upon enslaved labor. The transatlantic slave trade expanded dramatically. Ships crossed regularly between West Central Africa and Brazil. Angola became particularly significant. Luanda evolved into one of the principal embarkation points for enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic. The scale of this forced migration reshaped societies on both continents. Entire African communities experienced demographic disruption. Families were separated permanently. Political conflicts intensified as the demand for captives increased. Meanwhile, Brazil's population became increasingly diverse. Portuguese settlers, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, free people of African descent, individuals of mixed ancestry, merchants from various parts of Europe, missionaries, artisans, soldiers. The colony developed into one of the most culturally complex societies in the Atlantic world. Within this diversity, new traditions emerged. African musical rhythms blended with European instruments. Religious practices combined Catholic rituals with African spiritual beliefs. Foods from multiple continents entered everyday cuisine. Languages influenced one another. The Brazil that gradually emerged was not simply an extension of Portugal. It was becoming something distinct. The Portuguese crown attempted to strengthen administrative control over this increasingly valuable colony. Governors received clear instructions. Fortifications were improved. Tax collection expanded. Efforts to suppress smuggling intensified. Yet Brazil's enormous size created constant challenges. Communications between different captaincies remained slow. Much of the interior remained outside effective Portuguese authority. European settlement concentrated overwhelmingly along the coastline. Beyond those settlements stretched vast forests, rivers, mountains, and grasslands inhabited by numerous indigenous peoples whose societies continued to shape the continent. Among the groups pushing inland were men known as banderanis. Most originated from Sao Paulo. Initially, many expeditions focused upon capturing indigenous people for forced labor despite legal restrictions and missionary opposition. Others searched for precious metals. Still others explored previously unknown regions. Their activities remain controversial. On one hand, they greatly expanded Portuguese geographical knowledge of South America's interior. On the other, many expeditions brought violence, displacement, and destruction to indigenous communities. The banderanis would eventually play a crucial role in one of the greatest economic discoveries in Portuguese history. But before that transformation unfolded, another institution continued extending its influence throughout the empire. The Catholic Church. Missionary activity remained deeply connected with Portuguese colonial administration. Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, Carmelites, and other religious orders established schools, churches, hospitals, and missions across Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Their work often reflected genuine commitment to education and religious belief. Many missionaries learned local languages. Some documented indigenous cultures with remarkable detail. Others defended local communities against certain forms of exploitation. Yet missionary work also remained part of a broader imperial project. Conversion frequently accompanied cultural assimilation. European religious practices became official norms. Traditional belief systems were often discouraged or suppressed. In Brazil, Jesuit missions known as aldeias sought to gather indigenous populations into organized settlements where they could receive Christian instruction and agricultural training. Missionaries sometimes protected these communities from enslavement by settlers. This brought them into repeated conflict with plantation owners who demanded more labor. The disagreement reflected a larger tension within the empire. What should take priority? Commercial profit or missionary ideals? The answer varied depending upon the people involved. Some colonial officials sided with settlers. Others supported missionaries. The crown itself often attempted to balance competing interests while preserving royal authority over both groups. Across the Atlantic, relations with African kingdoms remained equally complex. The Kingdom of Congo continued maintaining diplomatic contact with Portugal despite increasing strains created by the slave trade. Farther south, Portuguese influence expanded gradually into Angola. Unlike earlier centuries when Portuguese authority remained largely confined to coastal settlements, military expeditions now ventured farther inland. Resistance was frequent. African states possessed their own military traditions, political institutions, and strategic objectives. Portuguese expansion therefore proceeded unevenly rather than through uninterrupted conquest. Commerce, diplomacy, alliance, and warfare all shaped these relationships. By the late 17th century, another challenge confronted Lisbon. The economy was changing. Sugar no longer guaranteed overwhelming profits. Competition from Caribbean colonies intensified each year. British, French, and Dutch plantations adopted increasingly efficient production methods. European markets became more competitive. Prices fluctuated. The Portuguese crown needed new sources of revenue. Ironically, the solution would come from regions of Brazil that only decades earlier had seemed distant and relatively unimportant. Deep in the interior, beyond the traditional plantation zones, explorers searching through river valleys and mountain ranges began making extraordinary discoveries. Small quantities of gold first appeared during the late 17th century. News spread rapidly. Prospectors rushed toward the region. Within only a few years, what had begun as scattered discoveries became one of the greatest gold rushes in world history. The area became known as Minas Gerais, General Mines. Its very name reflected the scale of what had been found. The impact on Brazil proved immediate. Thousands of migrants left coastal settlements. Portuguese immigrants crossed the Atlantic hoping for fortune. Merchants followed. Craftsmen arrived. Roads were opened through difficult terrain. New settlements appeared with astonishing speed. Some towns grew from temporary mining camps into thriving urban centers within a single generation. One of the most remarkable was Vila Rica, later renamed Ouro Preto. Nestled among the mountains, it became one of the wealthiest cities in the Americas. Gold transformed every aspect of colonial life. The Portuguese crown moved quickly to secure its share. Strict regulations governed mining. Royal officials supervised production. Taxes were collected through the quinto, requiring 1/5 of officially declared gold to be paid directly to the crown. Government foundries melted raw gold into standardized bars before export. Smuggling became widespread. Hidden compartments were built into wagons. Gold dust disappeared into clothing, tools, and everyday objects. Officials searched relentlessly for illegal shipments. The struggle between taxation and smuggling became one of the defining features of 18th century Brazil. The wealth flowing from Minas Gerais reached Lisbon in astonishing quantities. Portuguese royal finances improved dramatically. Public buildings were funded. Military expenses became easier to meet. The monarchy gained resources unavailable only a few decades earlier. European observers watched with fascination as Portugal, despite its modest size, once again enjoyed remarkable prosperity. But this prosperity carried hidden dangers. The kingdom became increasingly dependent upon Brazilian gold. Instead of encouraging broad economic diversification within Portugal itself, enormous quantities of precious metal often financed imported goods and foreign debts. Some historians have argued that this dependence delayed industrial development compared with parts of Northern Europe. Others emphasize the complexity of broader European economic trends. What remains clear is that Brazil had become the financial heart of the Portuguese Empire. Without it, Lisbon's position would have been far weaker. The mining boom also transformed Brazilian society. Enslaved Africans labored under brutal conditions in the mines, as well as on surrounding farms, supplying food. Free workers sought opportunities in trade and transportation. Merchants accumulated fortunes. Artisans found constant demand for tools, buildings, clothing, and religious art. Churches rose across mining towns, decorated with elaborate Baroque architecture funded by newfound wealth. One of the greatest artistic traditions in colonial Brazil emerged during this period. Yet inequality remained profound. Extraordinary fortunes existed alongside extreme poverty. Freedom remained denied to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people whose labor sustained the colony's prosperity. Communities of escaped slaves, known as quilombos, continued resisting colonial authority. The most famous, Palmares, had existed for decades before finally being destroyed in 1694 after prolonged military campaigns. Its history became a lasting symbol of resistance against slavery. As the 18th century began, Portugal once again possessed substantial wealth. But this was no longer the empire of Vasco da Gama or Afonso de Albuquerque. Its center of gravity had shifted. Asia remained important. Africa remained essential. Yet increasingly, the future of the Portuguese Empire would be decided not on the shores of India or the harbors of China. It would be decided in Brazil. And before long, another extraordinary figure would attempt to reshape both Portugal and its empire more dramatically than any statesman since the Age of Discovery. His name was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo. History remembers him as the Marquis of Pombal. By the middle of the 18th century, the Portuguese Empire had entered a new phase. The dramatic voyages of exploration that had once defined its identity were now centuries in the past. Portugal remained a global empire, but it no longer stood alone at the top of the maritime world. Britain had become the dominant naval power. The Dutch still controlled much of the Asian spice trade. France was expanding its own colonial ambitions. The Portuguese monarchy faced an increasingly difficult question. How could a relatively small European kingdom preserve an empire that stretched across several continents while competing against larger and wealthier rivals? The answer would come through reform. The man who came to dominate Portuguese politics during this period was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later granted the title Marquis of Pombal. Born into a noble but not especially powerful family, he built his reputation through diplomacy, intelligence, and administrative ability. When King José ascended the throne in 1750, Carvalho e Melo quickly became the king's most trusted minister. Over time, his authority grew so extensive that he effectively directed nearly every aspect of Portuguese government. His opportunity arrived under circumstances no statesman could have anticipated. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, Lisbon was struck by one of the most devastating natural disasters in European history. The earthquake occurred while churches throughout the city were filled with worshipers attending religious services. Buildings collapsed within moments. Survivors fled toward open spaces only to witness a powerful tsunami sweeping into the harbor and surging through the lower parts of the city. Fires ignited almost immediately and burned for days, destroying neighborhoods that had survived the earthquake itself. The scale of destruction stunned Europe. Modern estimates vary, but tens of thousands of people likely lost their lives. Much of Lisbon lay in ruins. Royal palaces, churches, government offices, libraries, and homes disappeared beneath collapsed stone and flames. Across Europe, philosophers, theologians, and scientists debated the meaning of the catastrophe. Some interpreted it as divine punishment. Others viewed it as evidence that natural disasters could not be understood solely through religious explanation. The earthquake became one of the defining intellectual events of the Enlightenment. Within Portugal, however, philosophical debates came second. Immediate action was essential. Carvalho e Melo moved with remarkable speed. He ordered the dead buried to prevent disease. Food supplies were organized. Looting was suppressed. Temporary shelters were established. The administration continued functioning despite the destruction surrounding it. One statement has become closely associated with his response. Whether recorded exactly as later tradition remembers it or slightly altered over time, it captures the spirit of his approach. Now, bury the dead and feed the living. The rebuilding of Lisbon became one of the most ambitious urban reconstruction projects of the 18th century. Instead of recreating the medieval street pattern, engineers designed broad avenues laid out in an organized grid. New buildings incorporated innovative structural techniques intended to improve earthquake resistance. Government offices, commercial districts, and public squares reflected Enlightenment ideas emphasizing order, rational planning, and efficient administration. Much of central Lisbon still reflects this reconstruction today. Yet the Marquis of Pombal viewed the earthquake as more than a disaster. He saw it as an opportunity. Portugal itself, he believed, required rebuilding just as urgently as its capital. The Portuguese economy had become heavily dependent upon Brazilian gold and foreign imports, particularly British manufactured goods. Administrative inefficiency, corruption, and the immense influence of powerful noble families limited the monarchy's ability to govern effectively. Pombal sought to change all of it. He strengthened royal authority. He reduced the political power of the traditional aristocracy. He reorganized government departments. He attempted to stimulate domestic manufacturing. Commercial companies received royal support to encourage trade. Economic policy became more centralized under direct crown supervision. One of his most controversial reforms concerned the Catholic Church. For more than 2 centuries, the Jesuits had played an extraordinary role throughout the Portuguese Empire. They operated schools, missions, universities, and religious communities stretching from Brazil to Japan. They had educated generations of colonial elites and often acted as intermediaries between colonial authorities and indigenous communities. Pombal increasingly regarded their influence as excessive. He accused the Jesuits of placing loyalty to the papacy above loyalty to the Portuguese crown. He believed they interfered with state authority and resisted necessary reforms. In 1759, he acted decisively. The Jesuits were expelled from Portugal and its overseas possessions. Their schools were closed, their property confiscated. Mission settlements were transferred to secular administration. The decision transformed education throughout the empire. Pombal hoped to replace religious instruction with a more practical system emphasizing mathematics, science, engineering, administration, and subjects useful for governing a modern state. In Brazil, the consequences proved especially significant. Jesuit missions that had long provided varying degrees of protection for many indigenous communities disappeared almost overnight. Although those missions had also encouraged cultural assimilation and religious conversion, They had frequently opposed efforts by settlers to enslave indigenous peoples. Their removal weakened an important institutional safeguard. Colonial officials and settlers gained greater influence over frontier regions. Pombal also reorganized Brazil itself. Tax collection became more efficient. Administrative boundaries were adjusted. Efforts to reduce corruption intensified. The Amazon region attracted particular attention. The Portuguese government encouraged settlement, hoping to strengthen its presence in territories that remained only loosely controlled. New forts appeared along major rivers. Small towns expanded, although distance and geography continued limiting government authority. Lisbon demonstrated renewed determination to consolidate its largest colony. Despite his many reforms, Pombal governed harshly. Political opponents faced censorship. Critics risked imprisonment or exile. The most dramatic example followed the so-called Tavora Affair of 1758. After King Jose survived an attempted assassination, Pombal accused several prominent noble families of conspiracy. Members of the powerful Tavora family were arrested, publicly executed, and their estates confiscated. Historians continue debating aspects of the case, but there is broad agreement that Pombal used the crisis to eliminate influential political rivals and strengthen royal authority. His methods remain controversial. Supporters describe him as the architect of Portugal's modernization. Critics emphasize his authoritarian tendencies. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. When King Jose died in 1777, his daughter Maria I dismissed Pombal from office. Some of his policies were softened. Others continued. The institutions he had created endured long after his political career ended. The Portuguese state had become more centralized, more bureaucratic, and more capable of directing imperial affairs. Yet even these reforms could not prevent the next great crisis. It originated not in Portugal, but in revolutionary France. The French Revolution of 1789 transformed European politics. Monarchies watched events with growing alarm. Over the following years, revolutionary governments fought coalitions of European powers before eventually giving way to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. By the early 19th century, Napoleon dominated much of continental Europe. His greatest remaining enemy was Britain. Unable to defeat the British Navy directly, Napoleon attempted another strategy. He established the continental system. European countries were ordered to close their ports to British trade. Portugal faced an impossible choice. For centuries, its alliance with England had formed one of the foundations of Portuguese foreign policy. British commerce remained vital to the Portuguese economy. Closing Portuguese ports would devastate trade. Refusing Napoleon risked invasion. The Portuguese government hesitated. Napoleon lost patience. In 1807, French and Spanish forces agreed to invade Portugal. As French armies approached Lisbon, Prince Regent João made an extraordinary decision. Rather than allowing the royal family to be captured, the Portuguese court would leave Europe entirely. With protection provided by the Royal Navy, dozens of ships departed Lisbon carrying members of the royal family, government officials, soldiers, servants, archives, works of art, and administrative records. It was one of the most remarkable evacuations in modern history. Instead of ruling from Europe, Portugal would govern its empire from America. After crossing the Atlantic, the royal court first arrived in Salvador before establishing its permanent residence in Rio de Janeiro. For the first time, A European colonial empire was administered from one of its own colonies rather than from the European homeland. The consequences were immediate. Brazil's status changed dramatically. Government ministries relocated. The royal treasury operated from Rio. Diplomatic missions arrived. European nobles settled in the city. Printing presses, previously prohibited in colonial Brazil, were authorized. Libraries expanded. Military academies were founded. Scientific institutions appeared. The Bank of Brazil was created. Most importantly, João opened Brazilian ports to friendly foreign nations in 1808. For centuries, colonial trade had largely been restricted through Portuguese monopolies. Now merchants from Britain and other allied countries gained direct access. Brazil entered global commerce more freely than ever before. Meanwhile, Portugal itself suffered through years of warfare. British forces under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, joined Portuguese troops in resisting the French occupation during the Peninsular War. Gradually, Napoleon's armies were forced out. By 1814, the immediate military danger had passed. Yet the monarchy remained in Brazil. Rio de Janeiro had become the effective capital of the Portuguese Empire. To reflect this reality, João elevated Brazil in 1815 from colonial status to an equal kingdom within the newly created United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This decision transformed political expectations. Brazilian elites no longer saw themselves merely as colonial subjects. Their country now stood formally beside Portugal within the same monarchy. When liberal revolutions erupted in Portugal in 1820, however, the situation changed again. The Cortes demanded constitutional reform. They also insisted that King João return to Lisbon. Reluctantly, he complied in 1821. Before departing, he left his son, Dom Pedro, as Prince Regent in Brazil. Many Portuguese politicians expected Brazil to resume its former colonial status. Brazilian leaders strongly opposed the idea. Years of hosting the royal court had transformed the colony politically, economically, and psychologically. Rio de Janeiro had functioned as an imperial capital. Its merchants prospered. Its institutions expanded. Its elites had tasted political influence on a scale previously unimaginable. Returning to colonial dependence seemed unacceptable. Pressure mounted on Dom Pedro to leave Brazil and return to Portugal. Instead, on January 9th, 1822, he made the decision remembered as the Dia do Fico. I will stay. The announcement electrified Brazil. Support for greater autonomy accelerated rapidly. Throughout the following months, Dom Pedro dismissed officials loyal to Lisbon, reorganized the administration, and increasingly aligned himself with Brazilian political leaders. Finally, on September 7th, 1822, while traveling near the Ipiranga River, Dom Pedro received new orders from Portugal demanding renewed submission. According to tradition, he responded by drawing his sword and proclaiming, "Independencia ou morte, independence or death." Brazil declared its independence. Within months, Dom Pedro became Emperor Pedro I of the newly independent Empire of Brazil. Portugal would formally recognize Brazilian independence in 1825 after diplomatic negotiations supported by Britain. The separation ended more than 3 centuries of Portuguese rule in South America. For Portugal, the loss was immense. Brazil had become the empire's richest possession. Its sugar, gold, population, and growing economy had sustained the monarchy for generations. Without Brazil, Portugal faced another moment of profound adjustment. Its future now depended increasingly upon territories in Africa. The age of the first Portuguese global empire had effectively ended. A new chapter, centered on Angola, Mozambique, and the changing politics of the 19th century, was about to begin. The independence of Brazil marked the end of one chapter in Portuguese history, but not the end of the Portuguese Empire itself. Although Portugal had lost its richest and most populous colony, it still possessed territories scattered across Africa and Asia. For many politicians in Lisbon, these remaining possessions represented not simply overseas lands, but the future of Portugal as an imperial nation. During the 19th century, as European industrialization accelerated and competition among the great powers intensified, Portugal turned its attention increasingly toward Africa. For centuries, Portugal's presence in Africa had been concentrated mainly along the coastline. Trading posts, forts, missionary stations, and port cities connected African commerce to the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. But large areas of the interior remained under the authority of African kingdoms and communities that had never accepted Portuguese rule. Angola and Mozambique, despite appearing vast on European maps, were only partially controlled by Lisbon. Inland societies maintained their own governments, economies, and military traditions. As the 19th century progressed, however, European attitudes toward empire began to change. Industrial economies demanded raw materials. National prestige became closely linked to colonial expansion. Advances in medicine, transportation, and military technology made deeper penetration into Africa increasingly possible. Across Europe, governments competed for territory in what became known as the scramble for Africa. Portugal, despite no longer ranking among Europe's strongest powers, hoped to preserve its historical position. Portuguese leaders argued that centuries of exploration and coastal settlement gave them legitimate claims over large parts of the continent. They imagined connecting Angola on the Atlantic coast with Mozambique on the Indian Ocean, creating a continuous belt of Portuguese territory stretching across Central Africa. On official maps, this vision appeared as the famous Pink Map, an ambitious proposal that reflected both imperial aspiration and historical memory. Reality proved far more complicated. Britain had its own strategic vision for Africa. British planners imagined a north to south corridor linking Cairo with Cape Town. The Portuguese proposal intersected directly with British ambitions. The disagreement culminated in the British Ultimatum of 1890. Britain demanded that Portugal withdraw from disputed territories in Central Africa. Portugal lacked both the military strength and diplomatic support to resist. Reluctantly, the Portuguese government accepted the ultimatum. The decision caused outrage throughout Portugal. Many citizens viewed the concession as a national humiliation. Public demonstrations erupted. Confidence in the monarchy declined sharply. Republican movements gained new supporters, arguing that the royal government had failed to defend the nation's honor. Although Portugal abandoned its dream of connecting Angola and Mozambique across the continent, it did not abandon Africa itself. Instead, Lisbon concentrated on consolidating the territories it still possessed. Military campaigns pushed farther into the interior. Administrative districts expanded. Railways and roads slowly connected coastal settlements with inland regions. European settlers arrived in limited numbers, particularly in parts of Angola and Mozambique. Yet Portuguese control remained uneven. Many African communities resisted. Some fought prolonged military campaigns. Others negotiated temporary agreements. Still others adapted while preserving important elements of their own political and cultural traditions. Colonial rule rested increasingly upon coercion. Forced labor became a defining feature of the system. Known in Portuguese as chibolo, compulsory labor required many Africans to work on plantations, build infrastructure, or serve colonial economic interests under conditions that offered little freedom of choice. Mission schools expanded, but educational opportunities remained limited for most Africans. Official rhetoric described Portugal as bringing civilization, Christianity, and development. In practice, colonial policy prioritized economic extraction and political control. Coffee, cotton, rubber, diamonds, timber, and agricultural products became central to the colonial economy. The benefits flowed overwhelmingly toward colonial authorities and commercial interests rather than local populations. Meanwhile, dramatic political changes unfolded in Portugal itself. In 1910, after years of instability and growing dissatisfaction, the Portuguese monarchy was overthrown. The First Republic replaced centuries of royal rule. Republican leaders promised modernization, education, and political reform. Yet despite these domestic changes, colonial policy remained remarkably consistent. The empire continued. Administration changed. Flags changed. Governments changed. The basic structure of colonial rule largely did not. The First Republic struggled with frequent changes of government, economic problems, and political instability. Military coups became increasingly common. Eventually, another transformation reshaped Portugal. In 1926, a military coup ended the First Republic. Over the following years, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar emerged as the dominant political figure. Initially appointed finance minister, Salazar gradually consolidated power and established an authoritarian regime known as the Estado Novo, or New State. Under Salazar, censorship expanded. Political opposition was suppressed. Secret police monitored dissent. Catholic values and conservative nationalism became central themes of government policy. The empire occupied a special place within Salazar's vision. Unlike several other European colonial powers that gradually began discussing political reform or eventual self-government for some colonies, Portugal insisted that its overseas territories were not colonies at all. Officially, they were overseas provinces. According to government ideology, Portugal existed across several continents as a single, indivisible nation. This language did little to change realities on the ground. Most Africans remained excluded from meaningful political participation. Economic inequality persisted. Racial discrimination continued despite official claims of a multiracial Portuguese nation. Education remained limited. Opportunities for advancement were restricted. As the Second World War ended, global attitudes toward empire changed rapidly. The United Nations promoted self-determination. Across Asia and Africa, independence movements gather momentum. India achieved independence in 1947. Dozens of new nations emerged during the following decades. European colonial empires gradually contracted. Portugal stood almost alone in refusing to reconsider its position. During the 1950s and early 1960s, organized nationalist movements appeared throughout Portuguese Africa. In Angola, several liberation organizations emerged, including the MPLA, the FNLA, and later UNITA. In Mozambique, Frelimo united different anti-colonial groups under a common movement. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC, led by Amilcar Cabral, developed one of the most effective liberation campaigns in Africa. Many of these organizations drew inspiration from wider anti-colonial movements. Some received assistance from newly independent African states. Others obtained support from the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, or other countries influenced by the broader Cold War. Portugal rejected negociations. Instead, it responded militarily. The colonial wars began. In 1961, violence erupted in northern Angola. Portuguese authorities responded with overwhelming force. The conflict soon spread. Guerrilla warfare developed in Guinea-Bissau. Fighting intensified in Mozambique. For more than a decade, Portugal committed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to campaigns across Africa. Many were young conscripts completing compulsory military service. They served far from home in unfamiliar environments against opponents who knew the terrain well and relied upon mobility rather than conventional battles. The wars placed enormous strain upon Portugal. Military spending consumed a significant portion of the national budget. International criticism increased. The United Nations repeatedly condemned Portuguese colonial policy. Many Portuguese citizens questioned why the wars continued with no clear end in sight. Thousands emigrated to avoid military service or seek better economic opportunities elsewhere in Europe. Within the armed forces themselves, frustration grew. Officers who had spent years fighting in Africa increasingly doubted whether military victory was possible. Many concluded that the wars served neither Portugal nor the people living in its colonies. This growing dissatisfaction eventually produced one of the most remarkable political events in modern European history. On April 25, 1974, a group of military officers launched a nearly bloodless coup in Lisbon. The movement became known as the Carnation Revolution. Its name came from ordinary civilians who placed red carnations into the barrels of soldiers' rifles as they occupied key positions throughout the capital. The flowers became symbols of peaceful change. Within hours, the Estado Novo collapsed. Marcelo Caetano, Salazar's successor, surrendered. Nearly 5 decades of authoritarian rule came to an end. The revolution transformed Portugal. Political prisoners were released. Censorship ended. Democratic institutions began to emerge. Just as importantly, the new government moved quickly to end the colonial wars. Negotiations with liberation movements accelerated. Guinea-Bissau gained formal recognition of its independence. Mozambique became independent in June 1975. Cape Verde followed. São Tomé and Príncipe achieved independence. Angola became independent in November 1975. The Portuguese Empire that had begun with the capture of Ceuta in 1415 effectively disappeared within little more than a year. For Portugal, decolonization brought profound social change. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers and people of Portuguese ancestry left the former colonies. Known as retornados, many arrived in Portugal with little more than the belongings they could carry. Housing shortages, unemployment, and economic adjustment created enormous challenges. At the same time, many of these families contributed valuable professional skills, business experience, and cultural perspectives that became part of Portugal's democratic transformation. The newly independent African nations faced immense difficulties of their own. Centuries of colonial rule had left economies heavily dependent upon exporting raw materials. Educational systems remained underdeveloped. Infrastructure often served colonial extraction rather than national development. Cold War rivalries intensified existing political divisions. Angola and Mozambique entered devastating civil wars that lasted for decades. Guinea-Bissau experienced repeated political instability. Independence had been achieved, but building stable post-colonial states proved an entirely different challenge. Portugal itself increasingly turned toward Europe. Democratic reforms continued. In 1986, Portugal joined the European Economic Community, later the European Union. Membership symbolized a decisive shift. The nation's future would now be defined less by overseas empire and more by European integration. Even so, two overseas territories still remained connected to Portugal. One was East Timor. When Portugal withdrew in 1975, East Timor briefly declared independence. Days later, Indonesian forces invaded and occupied the territory. Portugal never recognized the annexation and continued supporting East Timorese self-determination through international diplomacy. After years of conflict and international pressure, East Timor finally achieved internationally recognized independence in 2002. The other territory was Macau. For more than 4 centuries, this small enclave on the southern coast of China had served as Portugal's gateway to East Asia. Unlike many colonial possessions, Macau's transfer occurred peacefully through diplomatic negotiation. In 1987, Portugal and China signed the Sino-Portuguese Joint Declaration. The agreement established that Macau would return to Chinese sovereignty under the principle of one country, two systems. On December 20th, 1999, the handover took place. Portuguese flags were lowered. Chinese flags were raised. With that ceremony, the Portuguese Empire officially came to an end. Its history had lasted nearly 6 centuries. Few empires in world history endured for so long. Its legacy remains deeply complex. Portugal helped pioneer global maritime navigation. Its explorers connected oceans and continents in ways that permanently altered world history. Commercial networks established during the 15th and 16th centuries accelerated globalization, linking societies that had previously interacted only indirectly. The Portuguese language spread across multiple continents. Today it remains one of the world's most widely spoken languages, connecting communities in Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia. Portuguese architectural styles, legal traditions, cuisine, music, and religious institutions left lasting cultural influences from Brazil to Goa, from Angola to Macau. At the same time, the empire cannot be understood without acknowledging its violence. Military conquest displaced communities. Colonial rule imposed foreign authority over diverse societies. The Atlantic slave trade, in which Portugal played a central role from its earliest stages, caused immense human suffering that shaped the history of entire continents for centuries. Millions of Africans were forced from their homes. Families were separated. Cultures endured extraordinary trauma. The consequences remain visible today. Modern Portugal has increasingly engaged with this history through scholarship, public debate, museums, education, and dialogue with former colonies. The community of Portuguese language countries, established in 1996, reflects a different kind of connection. Rather than empire, it is based upon cooperation among sovereign nations linked by language and shared historical experiences. Portugal, Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and later Equatorial Guinea. These nations now shape the future together as independent states rather than parts of a single empire. The story of the Portuguese Empire is therefore neither a simple tale of triumph nor one of failure alone. It is the story of extraordinary maritime innovation, of ambitious rulers and determined explorers, of merchants, missionaries, soldiers, scholars, navigators, and ordinary people whose lives crossed oceans in ways their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. It is also the story of conquest, resistance, exploitation, adaptation, resilience, and cultural exchange. Its ships carried spices and silk. They also carried weapons and chains. Its voyages expanded knowledge of the world. They also transformed societies through conflict and colonization. For nearly 600 years, Portugal stood at the center of events that reshaped global history. Although the empire itself has vanished, the world it helped create has not. Its language continues to unite millions. Its cultural influence survives across continents. Its achievements remain studied. Its injustices continue to be examined. And its history reminds us that the rise and fall of empires leave legacies far more enduring than the empires themselves. The Portuguese Empire is gone. Its story, however, continues wherever the echoes of that extraordinary past still shape the present.